Hello and welcome today to our Einaudi Center for International Studies Summer Passport Series webinar, which is a conversation around the pandemic and what international studies has to tell us about this particular moment in our history and across the world. As you all know, certainly those who are joining us, our lives have been upended and changed dramatically by the COVID-19 pandemic. All fields of study are impacted as our medical, our agricultural, our economic and political and cultural systems are put into question. Human activity and our accompanying production models are starkly fragile and exposed to crisis. And structural systemic inequalities are laid bare in new ways. Marginalized or minority populations bear disproportionate costs from the pandemic and associated lockdown measures. For example, in the United States, Black Americans in particular have borne a disproportionate number of deaths from COVID-19 and from law enforcement. And many non-Black protesters have reasoned that Black people should not have to risk their lives alone in taking to the streets to demand that the state not execute its own citizens without consequence. These have led to dramatic and really historic protests across the country and indeed across the world in solidarity and expressing deep issues underlying in each country and its own particular manifestation. The pandemic reinforces the need to think differently and boldly about the world today and the world ahead, to imagine new research questions and respond in new ways and imagine the ways in which we will forge ahead collaboratively and reciprocally across the world. We will each use our disciplinary models and tools and current and historical understandings from this moment and to think about the future. As a political scientist, for example, the pandemic exposes to me the questions about state capacity to meet the needs of its citizens, as well as questions about the nature of trust and solidarity and common purpose. The crisis itself presents an opportunity to rethink the social compact, the ways in which many cases and places and live this social compact differently, and the ways in which the social compact itself is deeply frayed. And here we have an opportunity to rethink it and reestablish it based on ideas of voluntarism, of common purpose for shared well-being. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is truly a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. And we can choose to walk through this portal, dragging everything from the past behind us, the inequalities, the overuse of resources, our systems of hierarchy, or we can walk through it lightly and forge a new world ahead and to try to fight for it. Today, the Einaudi Center for International Studies at Cornell University and the Institute for Advanced Studies in Nantes, France, are asking these questions and applying their expertise to understand not only the pandemic, but the new questions that we must ask in the face of this crisis. Joining us today to discuss these issues are four distinguished scholars that I will introduce to you now, and then we'll pass along to hear each of their comments. Ezra Akjan is the 2019-2020 Frieda Miller Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. She is an associate professor and the Michael A. McCarthy Professor of Architectural Theory, Department of Architecture at Cornell University, and member of the Cornell Institute for Comparative Modernities. Ezra completed her architecture degree at the Middle East Technical University in Turkey and her PhD and postdoctoral degrees at Columbia University in New York. She also taught at the University of Illinois in Chicago, Humboldt University in Berlin, Columbia University, New School, and Pratt Institute in New York, and the METU in Ankara. Ezra received awards and fellowships from the Graham Foundation, American Academy in Berlin, the Institute for Advanced Studies in Berlin, Clark Institute, Getty Research Institute, Canadian Center for Architecture, Mellon Foundation, and many others. She is the author of Landfill Istanbul, 12 Scenarios for a Global City, published in 2004, and Architecture in Translation, Germany, Turkey, and the Modern House in 2012, and Turkey, Modern Architectures in History in 2012 as well, and Open Architecture, Migration, Citizenship, and Urban Renewal of Berlin by IBA in 2018. Currently, she is working on her book, Right to Heal, Architecture in Post-Conflict and Post-Disaster Societies. So I'll open it first to Ezra, and then we'll move to our subsequent panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. I would like to speak from the perspective of both my academic discipline, which is architecture and urban development, and area expertise, which is Europe and West Asia. Architecture and planning indeed have a lot to do with the pandemic, but not necessarily in ways that may be immediately apparent. During this process, many people simply blamed urban density, public spaces, public transportation, multi-apartment buildings, and suggested a new suburbanization and retreat from public services. These not only scapegoated city life, but were also oblivious to the other disasters of our time, such as climate change and food insecurity. Instead, according to me, recent events and data show that it is not only the coronavirus that causes the public health and social crisis, but the long-standing problems that are also connected to land settlement and the built environment. COVID-19 exposes how planning and architectural design that invented modern sanitary cities also produced economic and racial inequalities, as well as discriminatory and disciplinary structures. Today, many world cities are segregated along class, racial, and citizenship lines, and push disenfranchised populations to zones with worse environmental conditions and fewer healthcare opportunities compared to affluent neighborhoods. The fact that more people are dying during the pandemic in housing areas where people of color and immigrants reside has a lot to do with historically produced extractive land use policies. COVID-19 exposes many underlying conditions in Europe and West Asia as well, even though I would like to put a cautionary mark that we do not know sufficiently about this crisis to draw permanent conclusions. Many European countries were confronted with their own unpreparedness in a health crisis, as well as the geographic imbalance and insufficiencies of their public health services. When we look at the number of deaths in a million, we see that Belgium, UK, Spain, Italy, Sweden have shown the worst performances in the world, according to data so far. The pandemic also exposed the lack of solidarity among the European Union, at least when it comes to health services. A recent survey exposed a deep disillusionment with EU's response and relevance during this pandemic. The Union needs to confront the question if it simply is a good times network where each country is isolated and alone in times of crisis. The pandemic also showed that the global North or the West has a lot to learn from Asian democracies such as South Korea and New Zealand. In the authoritarian parts of this region, such as Turkey, the pandemic exposed the polarization of the society and the governing structure. For example, the central government was so worried about the success of opposition party municipalities that it blocked their solidarity campaigns and health-related services. The pandemic also exposed the lack of trust in the rulers in such countries. For instance, in Turkey again, there were chaotic moments due to the sudden shelter-in-place orders, which pushed hundreds and thousands to flow into the streets in order to stock up food and supplies. In many countries, we are once more confronted with the omnipresence and mistakes of neoliberal urbanization. For more than 3 decades, this system has prioritized real estate over green spaces, commercial over public services, sprawl over urban-rural systems with strong food supply chains, private sector opportunism over public health services. For instance, the assumption that each individual can save himself or herself in a private sphere, a house, seems to be another reflection of this lack of public services in a neoliberal world. But the truth is, only the privileged could afford to sustain themselves in this way, and we should have thought of more socially just responses. These could have included the redistribution of spaces, reprogramming of some buildings, and more sterilization services so that essential workers did not need to travel far distances and could work in safer environments. All these problems suggest that revisiting the current urban and architectural values and practices are long overdue. But I would like to put a cautionary mark to fast Band-Aid-like design solutions that have been suggested lately. These confuse temporary fixes for acute crisis, which are also necessary, but these confuse temporary fixes with real long-term reforms that come to terms with the hard truths of the world we currently live in. Think of each time things were reconstructed with slight or no improvement after a disaster. The real causes of recent crises following not only the pandemic, but also climate change, racism, xenophobia, and market crashes are unfortunately quite deeply ingrained and omnipresent in the current system. However, there isn't always the social or political will for true institutional, ethical, and political change on a global scale. So, what can be done from the perspective of planning and design? First, I hope that this crisis will not be handled in the same way as other recent disasters. There are countless examples in recent history where those in power use crisis opportunistically to further consolidate their privileges. Instead, real changes require significant will and organized solidarity. The list is long, but this may include, let me list a couple. Avoiding habitation in environmental hazard zones that affect the underlying health conditions of their residents and make them more vulnerable. Building less segregated cities and equally distributing resources so that all get equal benefits from public infrastructure. Calculating a careful balance of urban density between built and open spaces and environmental breathing zones. And remembering that this calculation will be different for each city due to the city's conditions. Planning for better connected urban-rural systems that produce a just and efficient food supply chain that cannot be easily broken in pandemics or other crises. Designing green and healthy buildings that consider the planet as a whole, not just save their wealthy clients, as in many examples of corporate environmentalism today. Innovating an effective and green surface sanitation infrastructure and investing significantly in the surface sanitation services of public transportation and waste management. Improving the global digital infrastructure with subsidized technology so that no one is left behind when we need to connect with means beyond the physical space. So the list can go on and new will be added as we know more about the virus, but in general, all these need to be thought both on a global and a local scale with global solidarity and attention to each place's specific conditions, because global crises such as a global pandemic cannot be handled with fragmented and isolated solutions. So this is it from me so far.
Thank you so much, Ezra. That's fantastic and a great way to start us off. Next, we will move to Marcelo Borges, who is a professor of history and the Boyd Lee Spar Chair in the History of the Americas at Dickinson College. He is also a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Nantes, and he teaches Latin American history and migration history. He is the author of Chains of Gold, Portuguese Migration to Argentina in Transatlantic Perspectives, published in 2009, and co-editor of Company Towns, Labor, Space, and Power Relations Across Time and Continents, and Migrant Letters, Emotional Language, Mobile Identities, and Writing Practices in Historical Perspective. Finally, he is also the author of Emotional Landscapes, Love, Gender, and Migration. He is also co-editor of a forthcoming volume on modern migration since 1800, part of a 2-volume Cambridge History of Global Migration series. And he is the co-editor of a book series, Studies in World Migrations, published by the University of Illinois Press. Thank you, Marcelo.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, the Einaudi Center, for the invitation. So I will present a little bit of an overview on Latin America. As it's the case for every major region of the world, it's difficult to talk about the pandemic in Latin America as a whole. It is true that the region has historical and contemporary commonalities, but it's also very diverse. And any generalization of any type of phenomenon about the region as a whole tends to obscure and flatten a complex reality. So a little bit of a background. The first COVID-19 case was reported in the 8th of February in Brazil. And in under a month, by March 20, there were cases in every country in the region. On May 22nd, the World Health Organization declared the region as a new epicenter of the pandemic. By June 7th, the region reported close to 1,200,000 cases. And now, as of this morning, 2.5 weeks later, the figure has grown to over 2 million and the number of deaths of the region has surpassed 100,000. Right now, the media presents Latin America as a hot spot for the pandemic. It's a very fluid situation. When one looks at the national level, there is a range of situations and trajectories that I think we need to take into account. Brazil, Peru, and Chile are the top 10 in the number of cases in the world right now. According to the last numbers, Brazil and Mexico are also in the top 10 in the numbers of deaths in the world, with Peru currently at number 13, Chile at number 18, and Ecuador at number 20. By far, Brazil has become the largest largest country with the number of cases, numbers of deaths, second only to the United States, but not as high as of today in terms of deaths per 1 million people. The situation in other countries, however, is not as dire today. All the cases continue to grow daily. Just to give you a couple of examples to show you the wide range. Today, Argentina has close to 50,000 cases and over 1,100 deaths, with 25 deaths per million. Bolivia, 27 cases, 75 deaths per million. Guatemala, about 15,000, 34 cases per million, to give you some top and middle cases. And on the other side of the spectrum as of today, you have cases like Costa Rica with about 2,500 cases and about 2 deaths per million, and Uruguay with about 900 cases today and about 7 deaths per million. The beginning of the winter in the Southern Hemisphere also may add other complications to this very fluid situation, including the onset of the flu season to a situation that is already very difficult. So diversity cases and trajectories. The same diversity is true in terms of levels of preparation and possibilities for facing a health crisis and for the ways in which government have acted so far. Policies have been implemented largely at the national, not at the regional level, and countries have to work within historic and structural limitations created by a wide range of levels of infrastructure, health systems capacity, and overall economic resources. And here again, the numbers are all over the place. Some countries are very bad in whatever comparison you consider around the world, particularly if you consider with the countries in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. If you are, depends on what indicator you take, numbers of beds per inhabitant, number of doctors per inhabitant are above that. Cuba, in some cases, Argentina, and others, Uruguay, and others, etc. So a wide range there as well. At the level of government reactions and policy implementations, we also see a huge variation. Diverse political realities and ideological and cultural projects and contrasting leadership styles have come fully into view in this pandemic. Attitudes and actions by political leaders and governments in the region run the gamut, from strict lockdowns when only few cases had been detected, to wishful thinking that the pandemic will somehow spare the population of their countries, to defiant anti-science positions from leaders that privilege advice of public health experts to leaders that, again, were combatant about any kind of possibility of any kind of restrictions and even negating that the pandemic existed. While several countries instituted strict measures early on, like Argentina, Bolivia, Colombia, Honduras, Peru, others opted for medium-range mitigation measures like Chile, Ecuador, Uruguay. And on the other hand, there are other countries and other leaders that were negating the existence of the pandemic and had a very haphazard kind of attitudes to very extreme combative ones. Just 3 cases. In Mexico, President López Obrador encouraged early on people to continue to consuming, to going out, to be happy, go to restaurants, etc. In Nicaragua, President Ortega organized in mid-March a Love in Time of COVID popular festival that was a huge gathering of people with floats and parades and dancing. But at the top of the podium of the anti-restriction and oblivious dismissal of any type of public health measures stands President Bolsonaro of Brazil. Not a day goes by that you won't find another action by Bolsonaro dismissing the gravity of the situation or actively acting against officials who implemented containment and mitigation measures or vilifying media coverage about his actions. All while the country has reached close to 1,200,000 cases and close to 54,000 deaths as of today's second in the world on both accounts today. So this is the brief overview. So what are the challenges that the pandemic has uncovered and that need to be addressed moving forward, and what are the opportunities? Despite this being a global phenomenon that does not respect any kind of political borders, so far policies have been implemented at the national level. It is unclear at this point if countries will continue in this direction or if the crisis will lead to renewed calls for to reinvigorate existing regional and international bodies and transnational initiatives. At the level of Latin American societies, this crisis has not necessarily, I would argue, created new problems, but exacerbated existing ones and put in evidence structural limitations and inequalities that had not been fully addressed and had worsened as a result of a weakened or poorer states. The pandemic has made them all more visible and urgent, while at the same time the immediate economic effects of the health crisis will create limitations of effective implementation of needed reforms. In some countries of the region, the pandemic has led to an exacerbation of deep political and ideological divisions. In others, to a momentary truce in social and political confrontations, and to a tenuous moment of collaboration across the political divide. Lockdowns on social distancing measures have halted heated political demonstrations for now, and early applications of public health measures to mitigate the propagation of the virus has led to political support for some national leaders beyond their own basis of support for now. In some cases, the pandemic has served to bridge deep political gaps and to quiet down demonstrations by opposition groups and street protests, but the issues behind those divisions have just been put on hold. And in a few cases, not only again here, Brazil is the one major one, the denial of the situation and the use of the pandemic to go after the opposition, the media, the scientific community and the academic community, and vast sectors of the population have exacerbated existing political divisions and created a danger of an institutional crisis. Throughout the region, the pandemic has deepened the tensions between the state and the market, sometimes presented in the crudest of terms as a dichotomy between public health or the economy. Many countries were already in dire economic situations, and for those who are not, it doesn't really matter anymore, as the economic consequences are going to be disastrous across the board in the region. The region has already about 200 million poor people, according to some estimates before the pandemic, and by the ACLA estimates that right now the pandemic could leave the region with 12 million people out of work and about 30 million new poor people. The informal economy was already very large in the region and will likely grow even more. The level of informal employment had made it already very difficult for people to comply with the strict lockdown measures and led to conflicts, as in order to gain something to eat daily, on a daily basis, millions in the region have no alternative but to leave their homes. Now, let me look this a little bit as a historian of migration, and I would like to point out a few ways in which the pandemic has brought to the fore the long-term effects of social differences and inequalities connected with mobility, such as ideologies of settler colonialism, population policies, and the legacies of historic migrations. Socioeconomic inequalities in Latin America are closely tied to demographics, to race, and to ethnicity. The way societies were created and the possibilities and limitations that policies of migration and displacement built on ideas of a desirable stock, privileged sometimes population over others, have contributed to the creation of highly unequal societies along those lines. These inequalities are visible in the way in which the pandemic affects different social groups. Race and ethnicity matter. Indigenous and Afro-Latin Americans fare worse, far worse than any other group, and describes the people of European descent. A recent Brazilian study, for example, points to a disparity of cases in the city of São Paulo, the largest city, along racial lines and racial categories, with some neighborhoods with majority Black population reporting 5 times the number of cases than others with majority white population. Race and ethnicity are compounded by class. The living conditions of the urban working poor further contribute to their vulnerability, and the situation is no better in remote rural areas. In the Amazonia region, for example, indigenous populations are being disproportionately affected as the pandemic reaches their territories. A lack of infrastructure, malnutrition, ineffective government support, and in many cases, outright hostility from loggers and miners with economic interest in their lands contribute even further to this vulnerability. And it's true throughout the world, the pandemic has also altered existing notions of mobility and immobility. If mobility has traditionally decreased as we move down the social scale, public health measures like lockdowns and social distancing have upended the situation, making immobility a privilege that many people can't afford and putting people from the lower echelons of society at higher risk. Workers in the service economy tend to live in the periphery of larger cities in Latin America and hardly dependent on public transport, for example. Policing of strict lockdowns in some countries, which is fears in some countries, have created situations of insecurity for individuals who have no choice than to venture out of their home to earn something for their daily livelihood. Like improper documentation to circulate, it is not uncommon for informal workers to be asked to leave buses and even face a fine. The gig economy is another example of the upending of traditional scale of mobility immobility and its negative effects on vulnerable groups. Finally, the imposition of a state of immobility and the subsequent economic crisis have created new challenges for internal and international migrants and refugees within Latin America, most notably for the approximate 5 million Venezuelan migrants and refugees that found themselves living in a variety of circumstances, mostly in Colombia and in other South American countries, many of whom were already in precarious legal and economic conditions. And at the same time, for countries in Latin America with a sizable population of migrants outside the region, working outside the region, the double effect of immobility and economic crisis has already increased their own vulnerability in the places of immigration and that of their families back home, who cannot rely on their economic support in the form of remittances, and the need to postpone dreams of return or family reunification. Migration policies are currently tightening in traditional migration destinations like the United States, and migrants from the regions may also face tougher policies, entry restrictions, and decreased employment opportunities in other destinations as economies will plunge around the world. This will not stop migration in the long term, but it will result in increased vulnerability and the possibility of growth of anti-immigrant sentiments and of xenophobia. So unfortunately, at this very fluid situation that is worsening in Latin America, the challenges are many. I don't have much else to offer right now, but a huge question mark. The only glimmer of hope, to end on a more positive note, is that the crisis, like many other in the region, the region has endured before, is also showing the resilience and the ingenuity of the population of Latin America, who managed to follow most of the very drastic measures imposed in many countries, embraced the need to protect the community at large, and in many cases organized themselves to provide and protect their own communities when state efforts fail short. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Marcelo. That's fantastic and really connects to the kinds of planning and architectural concerns that Ezra mentioned, and also to the Migrations Grand Challenge that Cornell has running in terms of thinking about the ways in which this pandemic really puts the spotlight on mobility, migration, and space. And so I think it really is a nice connection between both of your comments. So thank you. Next, I want to turn to Expedite Ologu, who is the founder of the Civic Academy for Africa's Future, based in Benin, and the Director of Politics and Governance Programs at the Frederick Ebert Foundation. Expedite holds a PhD in political science from the University of Oboe-Calavi, also in Benin, and he is a journalist, presenter, columnist, and political analyst at the Public Radio and Television of Benin, known as ORTB, for more than a decade before taking up the post of Director General of Media at the Ministry of Digital Economy and Communication. Expedite has been contributing for many years to the capacity building in political parties, political institutions, civil society organizations, public administration, and media in Benin and abroad. He is also a political, electoral, and media expert for international organizations such as ECOWAS and the African Union. And in this capacity, he has participated in several electoral evaluation and observation missions across the African continent. Expedite, thanks so much for joining us. You need to unmute.
Is it okay now? Thank you, Rachel. I just want to give some slides for the debate, so in such a way that people can understand what is happening with the pandemic in West Africa. Generally in Africa, like in any place all over the world, nobody were prepared to face this pandemic. And particularly in Africa, everybody was scared about that. And some of the analysts, the apocalyptic analysts, had announced that things will fall apart in Africa. But not only things have not fallen apart yet, it seems that Africa will resist more than nobody has expected in the past. But this resilience in Africa is not due to the real capacity of the majority of African states to face efficiently the pandemic. I think the first reason is that the pandemic has begun far from Africa, and the epicenter of the pandemic was not in Africa. Secondly, specialists were saying that medical or natural disposition of Africans can prevent them from the pandemic. But really, what we observe on the ground is that all of the countries that are very impacted by this COVID-19 pandemic are those whose national came from abroad. So the pandemic was brought from abroad. But the most important problems this pandemic can raise in Africa can be drawn from the way these states, the African state, manage or deal with the pandemic. We can see 2 or 3 ways of uses of this pandemic. From my side of political scientists, I can see that some states use the pandemic as an instrument, a means of controlling political mobilizations, such as the case in Togo after the presidential election. The opposition was about contesting the result, was about organizing uprising and so on and so forth. And the pandemic came on time for the Togolese government to put some disposition in the country in order to prevent opposition, for example, to go on the road for mobilization. And the second use I can observe in West Africa is the continuing of elections previously scheduled despite the COVID-19, such is the case in Benin. The communal elections that has been held in May 17 have been scheduled since weeks in the past. And when the COVID-19 came, everybody was expecting that this communal election should have been postponed in the future so that everything can be done for the security of people. But such was not the case. The election have been held, the results have been given, and the communal executive have been installed. The third observation about the uses of the pandemic in comparison of West Africa is from Burundi. There was there a kind of political messianism about the pandemic. Nobody, or the president, even the president in Burundi, does not believe that the pandemic is a problem, is a health problem that should be normally resolved by scientific research, by medicine, by drugs, and so on and so forth, by hospitals. The president Nkurunziza, who passed away recently, asked the citizens to pray, and that should be all. And he, as a pastor, was praying publicly to fight against the COVID-19. So this was used as a mean of political messianism to hide, I think, the eyes of the citizens about what is at stake during this pandemic. And now, moving from this observation of diverse uses of pandemic by incumbent regimes, there is a lot of questions that we can ask ourselves. The first of all is, what is the capacity of African states to take care of their citizens in time of health crisis? Secondly, what is the capacity of African states as such to face emergency, maybe there's health emergency, political emergency, and so on and so forth. Thirdly, what are researchers and researchers are capable of and for in Africa? As we see the debates around the drugs that has been put in place in Madagascar, for example, the COVID organics, the problem of the drug in Benin invented by Valentin Akcan, the debate on the efficiency of this drug or not, the capacity of African researchers to produce by themselves drugs to face the COVID-19. And fourth, what are the possibilities and the capacities of African states to organize the post-COVIDian era? Are they in the capacity of planning, of working for the future, the time after the COVID-19? What should it be like in Africa? And there are some challenges when we finish to ask these questions. For example, in West Africa, the question for African states should be, for example, what Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and so on and so forth can have to do with terrorism and pandemic in the future? What are the capacities of Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, these states which are now called as failing states, if they are not failed states, which are undermined or jeopardized by terrorism in Africa? What are their capacity to face at the same time the pandemic and the terrorism issue? Paradoxically, what we can see is that the state is back in Africa. The state is back, but because of the time of this pandemic gives the incumbency and the regimes all the powers to do what they want, despite the calls of civil society organization to pay attention to human rights and so forth, and so on and so forth. The state seems to be more and more present in our daily life, and secondly, to be stronger than we do not imagine it. So if this time of ours is very peculiar and very complicated for citizens like informal sector workers, like private workers, for example, this is very fantastic and interesting for the state. So if an actor has gained a lot from this pandemic, it should be the state, for my analysis. But the state not as an institution that can be analyzed as an actor that is very important in public policies, conception, public policies, implementation, and so on and so forth. But the state as a strategic actor against citizens, for example. And the other question as a challenge is, as we see it, this pandemic time has been a time of fighting between the East and the West, between China and United States of America. The question is, what should be the place, or what should be the choice of Africa between China and Africa and in America, in the United States of America? In the future, should Africa be close to China or to the United States of America? Because there is a new international order that is at stake now. And for me, I think that African countries, African states, should try not to be behind the more important powers in the world, but to try to prepare the era after this pandemic, to be one of the most important actors in international relations, in such a way that China and the United States of America should be obliged to negotiate, to discuss with them as an important actor who tried to face the pandemic moment by its own means, its own possibilities. And finally, there is a question on which we do not lay the stress in Africa. It is the way, what I call the obligation for African to be witch, or the obligation of African to be witchcraft in the noble, in the good sense. In the sense that Africans should be able to work on the social environment, the political environment, in the world, to change it without waiting for the others coming from the abroad. I'm using this concept from Boris Cyrulnik, who said that a man has to be a witch in a way that he has to use his language, his words, his capacities to change his environment. So this pandemic problem is posing a problem to Africa. How are they able to use the means, the traditional, medical traditional possibilities in Africa, local possibilities in Africa, to change their life, to face the problem they have, because now France, United States of America, China have no time to face African problem in the place of Africans. So how Africans are able to work in such a way they can use the means to face the problem of this pandemic in Africa. When you look at, you take a look on the numbers of cases in Africa, the deaths are around 8,000 or 9,000 of deaths on the continent. And some analysts are saying that the new or the forthcoming week should be very, very complicated for Africa. So it means that African countries need more than waiting, expecting help from China, from United States of America, and so on and so forth. And finally, for the forthcoming elections on the continent, in Cote d'Ivoire, for example, this year, in Guinea-Conakry this year, in Benin next year, what should be the effects or the impact of COVID-19 on these elections? The trends are that this time of ours will be used by the incumbent regimes to shape the elections. We saw in Benin, for example, for the communal election, that there was not physical campaign. Physical campaign was forbidden in Benin for the communal election in May. And this decision can be used again in most of the countries in the next year if, for example, the pandemic continues. So the candidates will not get the opportunity to go on the field to discuss with people, and they will be obliged to do their campaign exclusively on media. And we know how the medias in African countries are controlled by the incumbent regimes. So we can see that the future of elections after this pandemic time would not be very easy for the human rights, and also for the political mobilization and the transparency, the fairness of elections in the forthcoming weeks and months.
Beatty, thank you so much for your remarks. That's very helpful, and also I think really sets the stage for us to think about elections and the landscape, media possibilities across the world as well. Our final presenter is Jenny Goldstein, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Global Development at Cornell University, an Atkinson Center for Sustainability faculty fellow, and a core faculty member of Cornell's Southeast Asian Studies program. Jenny's work is driven by interest in environmental conservation and development in the tropics, the role of digital infrastructure in environmental governance, and human health impacts of ecological change. She has a PhD from UCLA in geography and has conducted research in Southeast Asia, particularly Indonesia, for the past 10 years. Two recent publications include The Volumetric Political Forest, Territory, Satellite Fire Mapping, and Indonesia's Peatland Burning, published in Antipod, and Beyond Slash and Burn, The Roles of Human Activities, Altered Hydrology and Fuels in Peat Fires in Central Kalimantan, Indonesia, in the Singapore Journal of Tropical Geography, and a forthcoming edited volume, The Nature of Data, Environments, Infrastructures, and Politics. Thank you, Jenny.
Hey, thanks so much, Rachel. And thanks to the other presenters so far. So I think some of what I have to say intersects quite nicely with, I think, how things are unfolding in other parts of the world. And some things are actually quite different in Southeast Asia. So to start with maybe a sort of glimmer of potentially good news, if people haven't been following what's going on in Southeast Asia closely in the last couple of months, some of the countries have actually dealt very well with this virus, particularly those countries that have strong centralized non-democratic states. So Vietnam, Singapore, Thailand, and Cambodia have done, again, very well at managing contact tracing, testing, and actually doing things like, say, bringing food to people who are quarantined and need it, and encouraging people to stay home, which has really built up, I think, a level of trust between the populations there and the governments in a way that we haven't seen in some other countries like Indonesia and the Philippines, for example, where despite being democracies, those countries have quite low levels of trust in the federal governments right now and are currently experiencing the highest rates of both COVID incidences and also deaths in Asia after China. So I think, this brings up a lot of really interesting questions. I think in the kind of short term, looking at what Vietnam, Thailand, Singapore have done right is really instructive in how countries can respond to global health crises. These countries, of course, have had more experience in dealing with them because they faced SARS and several other viral outbreaks early in the 21st century. So some things that the pandemic has made me think about, I guess, and reflect on the past decade of my experience in Southeast Asia. And I'm saying this as we all are, having not been there on the ground since January, since things have really started to change. But things in the past 15 years in Southeast Asia have already changed really dramatically, right? There's a rapidly rising middle class there that I think a lot of people who haven't visited the region might not be aware of. If you've ever visited Bangkok or Jakarta or Saigon or Singapore, it's not hard to recognize that all of these cities and countries have really robust middle classes, in addition to, of course, extremely wealthy populations and extremely poor populations living on the margins of cities and also in rural areas. So I think, the questions of how these countries will emerge economically from this pandemic is really interesting and important to look at. I don't think they will all be the same because they all have very different ties to the global economy, right? And different portions of those populations are very differently tied into the global economy. Another really important question, I think, looming on the horizon that Expedite mentioned as well, is how Southeast Asian countries will turn toward or away from China as the de facto leader in the region. They've been struggling with this issue in very different ways for quite a while, with some countries like Vietnam and Cambodia basically in some ways becoming, kind of puppet states of China and doing a lot of their bidding as China asks for it, whereas countries like Indonesia have been quite resistant to Chinese pressure and instead have tried to maintain alliances with the United States. I think in light of the fact that the US currently has quite poor management of the pandemic, whereas China has gotten things under control, that might really shift attitudes there and how they might be more sympathetic towards Chinese demands in the future. So some sort of bigger ways of thinking that I guess have been thinking about and would encourage others to do as well is how this pandemic might shift us out of old paradigms of thinking about development. And I think Southeast Asia is really instructive in that sense for reasons I kind of just mentioned. So, we don't really think of the world in terms of first or third world countries anymore, but we do still continue to think about them in terms of developed versus developing countries, right? Those are sort of quick labels we often use to label nation states. And I think, for reasons I just mentioned in Southeast Asia, it's not really that accurate to compare at a national scale developed versus developing, right? Singapore has the highest per capita income, I think, in the world and much more developed infrastructure. They're much more sophisticated in a lot of ways than any place in the United States, I would argue. Whereas, of course, you have Myanmar, right, which is kind of still in the bottom of developing countries. So I think, this paradigm, if it's not accurate as applied to across, or rather between countries, it is still sort of helpful to understand what's happening within countries themselves, right? So I think this might actually shift the level of scale at which we can analyze problems and start to think about the impacts rather than kind of comparing things at the national scale, to think about other units of analysis, other scales of analysis, right? Whether it's regional or local, and what the relations between these scales might be. Because in a lot of ways, I think cities in Southeast Asia, such as Jakarta, Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, are much more closely integrated than the further flung islands in the Philippines or Indonesia are to any of the major capital cities, right? So I think, again, the nation state is kind of losing its hold on being a useful way of thinking about development in a lot of ways. Okay, so the other thing I wanted to mention, of course, this is sort of my area of interest, is the role of the environment in the pandemic. And this is, of course, a really important issue because the virus, the coronavirus, is presumed to have originated in, of course, the environment, in environmental issues in China, right? And you know, Southeast Asia has undergone really dramatic environmental change in the past 20 years. They have the highest rates of deforestation in the world, especially when Brazil was able to reduce theirs. Indonesia's tropical forest deforestation continued to increase quite dramatically. Mainland Southeast Asia has had really rapid rates of habitat loss and biodiversity loss in the past 2 decades. And some of these issues have actually led directly to the proliferation of some of these viruses, right? Whether it originated in southern China, south of Wuhan in Yunnan, or in northern Vietnam. You know, a lot of these viruses are being transmitted through animals who have lost habitats and are therefore moving closer to population centers. The role of expanding industrial agriculture into areas that were once forested is also a potential conduit for the spread of zoonotic diseases, right? As is wildlife poaching, which continues to be a really major issue in Southeast Asia, of traders going into once very remote forests to poach wildlife animals, whether for consumption, human consumption, or for other sorts of values. So we have to pay attention to these issues, right? So in many ways, the current crisis is actually a result of environmental change directly in Southeast Asia and its ties with China. So one kind of, I think, way of thinking about this moving forward that I found, I mean, so while this all seems, I think, very depressing on one hand, one thing that has been encouraging, I would say, in looking at environmental issues in the past couple of years in Southeast Asia is that, you know, for the past couple of decades, the United States and Europe has really dominated global environmental thinking in terms of proposing, say, climate change, global, you know, the attention to the global environment as the predominant way of enacting environmental protection, right? So climate change, biodiversity, protections for the sake of biodiversity protections is sort of the current, and has been the ongoing environmental ethic, I would say, among donors and wealthier countries. But one interesting shift that's happened that I've seen in Indonesia, for example, is that the environmental impacts on human health directly, on the health of their populations, has actually taken a much larger, it's been a much larger driver of potential change in some of these countries. So while they have a hard time, I think, justifying environmental protections for sort of the sake of the global, they're much more apt to enact policies and changes that might protect their own populations. And I'm speaking to this in relation to the ongoing very extensive land fires that Indonesia and Malaysia experience almost annually, but at least every several times a decade now. And this affects, you know, respiratory health of millions of people across Southeast Asia. And the governments there have really responded to this crisis, not because of the global sort of impacts of this air pollution and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, but because so many people are simply getting sick and have increased mortality over the long term because of these fires. So while this is, again, depressing on one hand, I think it reflects a potentially new and positive change in direction in terms of how the environment is sort of thought of and conserved in some sense, and thought about how we might restore it. If we can put human health sort of at the forefront of driving those changes, and then things like climate change come alongside that as a kind of ancillary benefit, that might actually be, for some of these countries, a more productive way forward than I think the kind of past global environmental ethic has been, which simply hasn't worked, I would say, in most of Southeast Asia in the past couple of years. So just one kind of closing comment I wanted to make, given that we're talking about international studies, and I'm speaking, obviously from the perspective of an American educated in US-based institutions, but especially to the undergraduates who might be listening, I think, past global crises have really strengthened international studies in so many ways. So the, robust federally funded area studies programs in the US started as a direct response to the Cold War. And those are still with us very much so at Cornell, especially. I was an undergraduate during 9/11, living in New York. And while it seemed like a really harrowing time to think about international travel just after 9/11 and the turn towards security concerns and terrorism, within that decade, the US State Department had actually dramatically increased research for a lot of international studies, especially those with Muslim populations, which is not coincidentally how I ended up in Indonesia. So I think while international travel seems really scary and not feasible right now, I would just say, don't lose sight of the fact that I think there will be many more opportunities to do so in the future, because these times of global crisis have actually I think, encouraged students to go abroad with the backing of universities. So while it seems not safe and feasible now, I think that will change sooner than we think. So thanks.
Fantastic, Jenny. I think that's so true. And I think that, your last point really connects as well to the kind of original remarks that Ezra made in terms of thinking about digital connectivity and new ways of connecting, particularly across boundaries or expanses that we might have thought of as previously more difficult or more challenging. Your comments were also excellent, and I want to just take this opportunity to summarize a few of questions and points of connectivity amongst you, because I think there were really important themes that all of the regional approaches highlighted. And then I'll turn it over to each of you to answer in 1 minute and take up the parts that you like. The first question is thinking about, all of you in different ways mentioned space, and thinking about the subnational, the very local, the ways in which the nation state itself is maybe under-equipped to handle some of the variations across space and context that the pandemic creates or highlights and exacerbates, but also the role of regional organizations, in particular, the Organization of American States. The African Union has played a very large role, not only in terms of setting up its own, having experienced previous crises, setting up its own health organization, renegotiating debt at this time, thinking about the European Union. Is this an alliance of convenience that breaks down in moments of crisis? Or are these ways in which we can really integrate and think about the ways in which threats and opportunities move across national borders? So that's one question that I think there's a lot of connectivity on. Another is how we are thinking about new models of development. And I think Jenny's comments, Ezra's, everyone's really spoke to this, but where are we going after this pandemic in terms of new ways of approaching not only developing versus developed, but sustainable development for all? And then finally, just to also keep it brief, that connection to industrialized animal farming, the way in which we think about environmental degradation and extraction, does this moment really push us into new directions on that front? So I'll ask each of you to answer in 30 seconds, and thanks to the audience for amazing questions as well. Ezra, we'll start again with you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I think in terms of new models of development and so on, I mean, I think we are at a crossroads where the future might bring all of the same or might bring some more resistance. I mean, when the pandemic was going on, there was this discussion about whether democracy or totalitarianism is better to deal with the crisis and so on. I mean, the truth is there's a democratic way and there's a totalitarian way to deal with the crisis, and it depends on which one we choose. So I would be more concerned about the fact that the pandemic is seen as the only narrow perspective that the world responds to and starts opportunistically to promote more xenophobia, more totalitarianism, and so on. So I think I think the resistance should be looking at the modes of development that is not only about the pandemic, but that also considers other disasters, including climate change, food insecurity, and so on. And just like there's a democratic and totalitarian way to deal with the crisis, I think there's a way to deal with this crisis that also considers other disasters that are waiting the world. And in terms of the regional organizations, African or European Union and so on, I mean, I would probably think the more global we can think and the more comparative we can be to learn from others' mistakes, but at the same time always be aware of the local specificity of the urban density and so on, the better. I mean, I would root for global solidarity rather than just regional solidarity. So maybe that was my 1 minute. I saw some other questions, but we may return to that. In the chat, I saw some other questions, but I may answer those if there's time.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ezra. To Marcelo.
Thank you. So I'll take briefly the one about regional responses. So far, in the case of Latin America, has been largely absent. The Organization of American States in particular has been issued sort of guidelines and documents about how to deal properly with hopefully with the pandemic in terms of social inequalities, racial inequalities, gender inequalities. There's been documents, but also recently, I think it was yesterday, the Yanomami nation of Brazil has appealed to the Organization of American States to try to stop the Brazilian, to force the Brazilian state to do something about the invasion of loggers and miners of their own land. So whether that will lead to something, I don't know. But right now, it's been only declarations and no action.
Thank you, Marcelo. And to Expedite.
Yeah, I will respond to the two questions by Beatty in 1 minute. As far as international organization involvement is concerned, you can see a kind of, if not a death, but a coma of the liberal theory of international organization. We see the way they involve in the pandemic resolution, even if you take the case of the World Health Organization, this organization was not so strong to give advice, to give them the best solution to the countries. And on the way of the new model of development in Africa, I can see that the pandemic is not favorable to democracy in Africa, because we saw that in the country in which the best solutions have been given to fight against the pandemic, these countries are not so democratic. They are authoritarian. If you take, for example, Rwanda, you can see it. And if you take some democratic countries, you can see the incapacity of these countries to face correctly or efficiently the problem. And more largely, when you see how China faced the pandemic, and when you see how the United States of America faced this pandemic, for African states, which are debating between China model and American model, I think that the choice is done by the pandemic, that democracies are not so efficient to resolve emergency problems, to resolve critical problems in this time of ours.
Thank you, Expedite. I think that the model comparison is very apt, and also one that many people are looking at, although I would argue that many of the more autocratic states have also had a very difficult time coping with the pandemic, and the problem of information and the bottom-up spread of information in itself was a part of the rise of the pandemic to begin with. So these are many questions on our plate, and particularly as we think about the role of media and circulation of truth and accurate information and science, in addition to being able to express social concerns in the face of this pandemic. To Jenny.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, so I think I actually said in my earlier comments most of what I have to say off the top of my head in response to those really excellent questions. But I will just add in to what the conversation is going on here about models of democracy or other. And I would say that it's not just a choice between the US or China, right? Between full democracy, decentralized democracy, and a sort of totalitarian regime. I think Southeast Asia offers a much broader range of forms of state governance right now than the US or China alone does. You know, Singapore, I think you could call it a lot of different things. I sort of call it a benevolent authoritarian state, right? A lot of people there are quite happy with their government, even at the loss of things like free speech. because this government has provided them with such material wealth, right? And the same would be true in Vietnam. They've had extraordinary economic growth, so they're willing to put up with, curtailments on things like free speech and the right to vote freely. But at the same time, those countries are not surveilling their populations in the same way that China is. I think a lot of the data coming out of those countries can be questionable, but the citizens in those countries also have better access than China does to global information and to be able to share that data on social media, for example, rather than China. So I would just say, I would caution away from the binary way of thinking, right, of the US versus China or democracy versus totalitarianism, and say that there's a lot of variation in between there. And Southeast Asia is actually a really great place to look for some of that variation. So thanks.
And if I may add, 3 countries, New Zealand, Germany, and South Korea, are also democracies who, which really dealt with the crisis in very good ways.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that relationship between the public using this moment to be able to identify so many of the systemic inequalities that all of you have mentioned, and the relationship between people and space, resources that the state could provide, and the needs of society is really, I think, an important and stark element of this pandemic moment that we face. So thank you all so much for your participation. Thanks to our audience for joining us. And please continue to be in touch with your questions, as we didn't have as much time as we'd like to answer them all. But I really thought this was a very enriching discussion and appreciate your involvement. Take care, everyone.